Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for joining me in our session today. I am going to be talking about podcasts for all, using and creating podcasts with students and for students. I'd like to introduce myself. Hi, I'm Laura. I am a fourth grade teacher at Walnut Grove. This is my 14th year teaching, and I am almost done with my EDS and instructional technology. I'm getting it at Kennesaw. It's phenomenal. So today we're going to talk about podcasting. Do you guys like podcasts? I love them. Okay. So I'm going to show you guys like my top 5, if I had to choose, my top 5 favorite podcasts. And I want you to think about, what does that tell you about me as a person? It's My Favorite Murder, Science Rules with Bill Nye, LeVar Burton Reads by LeVar Burton, Sci-Fi, and Counter Clock. So when you look at these podcasts, you probably know a little bit about me. I am definitely an 80s, 90s baby, right? Bill Nye and LeVar Burton. I also love true crime. I really enjoy listening to it. And I really like science. It's one of my favorite things to learn about. In our classroom, we're going to have students who are going to enjoy podcasts too for multiple reasons. I find that I like listening to a story. It helps me remember a little bit more. So that's one of the ways that like learning reaches me in my modality. I also have a really hard time sitting still. So listening to a podcast kind of helps me. I can find things to keep my hands busy, and it fits my personality. In our classroom, we're going to have students that are going to like podcasts just like I do. Podcasting is a booming industry right now. In 2018, there were only about 26% of people who had listened to a podcast before. Today, over 48% of people listen to podcasts. And there's over 2 million podcasts. So you're definitely going to find a podcast that you could like or that your students will like. So with all of these podcasts available, how are you going to find one? And that's the easy part, right? You're going to go to Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Google, even a Google search, and then you can find podcasts that way. And just like you would with any video you're going to share, research and review. So at the beginning of the school year, we're always talking about community building. How are we going to support students in our classroom to build a community where they feel safe and secure? How are we going to do that with podcasts? Well, at the beginning of the year, it's really important to set up our routines and our expectations and our procedures. And that's especially true when we're using technology. We want to make sure we're teaching students about what's allowed. When we incorporate podcasts in the classroom, you're opening up diverse stories, diverse voices. You're bringing the world into your classroom. You're also sharing the classroom with the world. So you want to make sure that you're setting up the right boundaries, privacy, and expectations. And when we communicate with outside of the classroom or listening to a podcast inside the classroom, what it does is it allows us to allude to experiences, just like with a shared book. When you read aloud a book, you're creating a shared experience for your class. The same is true with a podcast. It gives us a shared experience that we can allude back to, we can refer to, and that everybody's been able to participate in. One of the benefits of podcasts is that the students are able to kind of hang up their reading hat and engage with the material without the pressure of reading, which is especially helpful for our ELL students and our students with language processing disorders. So podcasts for students, there are so many out there, right? And we talked about how you could kind of find them through the podcast libraries using Google. You can also search for a specific topic. So for example, middle school, high school, if I'm teaching about the Bay of Pigs, I might want to search that key term, Bay of Pigs, in the podcast library, and it'll pull out podcasts that are specific episodes to that. When you're researching podcasts, you definitely want to do your review and research. So commonsense.org is a great website that allows you to view ratings and read reviews of materials. Also, once again, just like you would with a video from YouTube, you're going to want to preview your your podcast. Okay, best practices. So now that we're going to talk about, you're going to bring a podcast in your classroom, let's talk about the best practices for bringing them in. One thing that I really want to hit home is that listening is literacy. We often overlook listening and speaking standards because we think students are always engaged, right? They're talking to their friend, they're talking to their group, they're talking to you. And that's true. They're communicating often, but where are they getting the opportunity to improve their listening and speaking? Podcast really gives them that opportunity to practice that. The next best practice is choosing an appropriate length of time. Attention spans in students is about their age length. So I'm a fourth grade teacher. They're 10 years old. So I'm looking at about 10 minutes, give or take a couple of minutes. So you really want to focus that learning. And that's kind of our next idea is directed learning. There are great podcasts out there that are phenomenal. Like Smash Boom Best is a debate podcast. It's 45 minutes. My little 10-year-olds aren't going to sit still for 45 minutes. So instead, what we need to do is we need to direct their learning. If I'm trying to get them to think about their listening and use it to support learning, I want to focus in on timestamps and keep it within their attention span. Now, I'm not saying that the whole podcast has to go out the window. We might break it down, just use this section, or we might break it down into chunks over a couple of days. Okay. And then this is the last and most important. We need to actively teach digital citizenship. So what is digital citizenship? That's the sharing, safety, privacy, and respect to others. Students are leaving a footprint, a digital footprint in the world. Think about your students, right? How many of them have TikTok, Snapchat, Twitter? I don't know if kids have Twitter, Instagram, right? They need strict guidelines to help them realize what can be shared safely on the internet. What are like best practices for that? And I don't want to say this and scare you guys off from making your own podcast because our students are already using the internet. They're already on social media. So instead of shying away from it, we need to take this opportunity to teach students the correct way to participate and create content for online. Okay, so now let's say you have your podcast that you're going to listen to. Like, what in the world are you going to do with it? Right? What are we going to do with this podcast? Well, you can use a great starting place is using a graphic organizer, right? Graphic organizers support engagement. They keep a focus on the literacy skill that you're trying to attach to the podcast, and you can develop it that way. So here's an example. Let me give you an example of something I've done in class. During my Revolutionary War unit, I found this awesome story by Stories podcast called Sybil, the Hero of the American Revolution. Okay. So at the same time in reading, we were going through elements of a story or a story plot. The exposition, meeting the character, the rising action, the turning point, the falling action, and the resolution. That's what we were kind of working on, putting all of that together into a story map. So I had the students listen to the story and they could fill in the story map as they went. Now, I have students in my classroom who are ELL. I have students who have IEPs, need language support. So I can differentiate this learning as well. What I chose to do was I made little pre-typed boxes of parts of the story. And then the students, as they were listening, were able to put them in order and in the right place in the story map. This is one of the ways that I can support my students who need differentiation. I also don't have to do this exact graphic organizer. For example, when I get to American Revolution this year, maybe I'm not doing a graphic organizer on story plot and story parts. Maybe we're working on perspective. So I can use Sybil, the Hero of American Revolution, that podcast again, but I can do a different graphic organizer. Instead, I can think about perspective. And instead, I would have them view first person perspective from the dad's point of view while Sybil is out warning everybody and how she saves the world. And so I can really alter the graphic organizer I choose to support the standards that I'm going. So this is going to be a very brief overview in how to create a student podcast. I'm going like super bird's eye view. here for how I use Anchor.fm to support students who are ready to create a podcast. In my digital takeaway, I have videos and articles for you to watch and read that give a more step-by-step direction. So first, if you're thinking right now, there is no chance my students can make a podcast, I promise they can. And I'm going to give you a brief overview and talk you through how I've set it up in my classroom. Okay, so the first thing we do is we always organize. I give them very specific topics, leads. What do I want them to do? What's your end product that you're working for? Here in the organize, we use our graphic organizers that they used earlier. When they were using pre-created podcasts, I take those graphic organizers now that they're comfortable and they know what a podcast is supposed to be like. They use those graphic organizers to build the podcast they're working on. In this time as the teacher, I conference with students, I work with them. It's very similar to the writing process in the way that you revise, edit, practice. Once we have done and we're ready to record, we record. So Anchor.fm is a free website. We'll talk a little bit more about it, but you can upload, edit, add music, intros, outros, everything here. And you'll do this in Anchor.fm. Then after you've recorded your podcast, you share it. You decide who you want to share it with. Do you want to just share it with your families? Do you want to share it with your school? Do you want to share it with other schools? What's the reach that you want your podcast to get to? And then also after we share, students should always reflect, how did they communicate? How did they share out with others? What could they improve next time? What are something that they're proud of? And this is kind of the general overview for how you'll make your own podcast. Now, I know you guys are like, but tell me more about Anchor.fm. Don't worry, we're here. Anchor.fm is free to use and it's easy to use, right? A couple clicks and you'll be figuring it out. In Anchor.fm, you can add transitions, music you record straight from your computer. You can also use it on a phone. And you can host the podcast you create on Anchor.fm. You can also choose to allow it to share it to other podcast libraries like Apple, Spotify, Google. Now, I want to talk to you about when you're doing this in class, don't give your students your Anchor.fm password because that's where it's all hosted. So if you have students recording multiple people at a time, what I recommend that you do is you use the website Vocaroo, and instead the students will capture their audio there. They can give you the link or they can download it and put it into the Google Classroom or a Google folder somewhere you can get to it. Once you download the audio, you can upload it into Anchor. So if you have a lot of students or you ask them to do it at home for homework, you can just bring in the audio because you can't have more than one person logged into Anchor.fm. And once again, that's definitely not a password you want to share with your students. Okay, so from Anchor.fm, you create your episodes, you add your music. And once again, in the digital takeaway I have step-by-step videos that I found where you can see how to do this with step-by-step directions. Okay, so now podcasts for all. What podcast can you make in your classroom? You might be asking. You can do something like question of the week, sharing writing, interviewing or chatting with students. Students can share their learning. You can make podcasts yourself for your students where you're talking about what you're teaching and book reviews. And one of the best ways to get ideas for your classroom is I'm going to share with you some podcasts that you could mimic. So these podcasts are not podcasts I would share with my students. Not that they're all necessarily inappropriate, but like mimicking these podcasts. The weirdest thing I learned this week, right? It's these 3 writers from Popular Science, and they talk about the weirdest thing they learned this week and they share it with others. So that might be something you could use in your classroom. Stuff You Should Know podcast, actually from Atlanta, but the podcasters, they just kind of take a general question or something they've always wondered about. They research it and then they share it. Book reviews, popular books, where they tell you what the book's about. Conan O'Brien Needs a Friend. This one I most closely think about chatting with a student. He meets people, he talks to them, and it's a great way to build a community and highlight different students in your classroom. Stuff You Missed in History class is something you learn about in class, but then they go through and they find out more information and more details. So that might be a really great extension idea. And then NPR host Wait, Wait, Don't Tell Me, which is hilarious. They pull celebrities and then they ask the celebrities to decide if the fact they're giving is real or fake. And so that would be like a really good one to mimic as well with your classroom, where you share maybe science or social studies information and have them decide if they think it's a real fact or a fake fact. So once again, these are ways that you can get ideas to use podcasts in your classroom. And don't try everything at once, right? I don't want to overwhelm you guys and be like, oh, let's do it all at once. No. You want to start with using podcasts that have been pre-created. Let students get used to what a podcast is and how it works. Then you want to move into how can we make our own podcast? And you, just like we scaffold in class with writing and reading and tasks, like you want to give them very structured, graphic organizers. What's the task? What's the product supposed to look like? What's the rubric, right? Then from there, once the students get a hang of that type of podcast, then you can bring in other types of podcasts that you would want them to mimic when they're creating. So I know this was so much information at once, but it's all so good. I wanted to share it all with you. Pre-created podcasts and creating your own podcast. So I've created a digital takeaway. It's that bit.ly/pods in the class. And in that podcast takeaway, I've got data and research for why you should be using podcasts in the classroom. I've got lists of curated podcasts for elementary, middle school, high school. I also have graphic organizers for you to grab, links to extra graphic organizers. And then I broke down some getting started lessons, and I kind of gave ideas for how you could get started and have linked to materials you could use. I hope you guys find this important and something wonderful you could use in your classroom, and something that you could use for students to become creators in your classroom as well. If you have any questions or need any help, please feel free to reach out to me. Email me, Laura Ventura Gwinnett. And I really look forward to you guys bringing podcasting into your classrooms. Thank you so much for joining me for today's session.